So today in class, we are going to watercolor paper for the backgrounds of our projects. And the first thing I want you to do is look at your plans and try to determine which plan you want to use for your final project. I have a number here, and let's say I'd want to use this plan for my final project. Judging on the colors I've already used, I've used greens and a fade of red, orange to yellow, and some neutrals as well. I need to try to figure out what color backgrounds I would paint on my watercolor paper that will complement my existing colors, if these are the colors I want to use for my final project. So I could consult the color wheel and see which colors would be a lot different for the backgrounds. So that way these colors would pop against that background. If I were to paint the backgrounds in similar colors to what I've already used, then the images, the shapes would kind of blend in with my backgrounds. And I think I want to create more contrast. So since I think I'm going to use more greens in this design, if I was going to finish applying the oil pastels and the markers, I think that for a background, I'm going to do purples and blues on my background for today, because these colors against a purple kind of blue background would really pop and create contrast or a large kind of difference in the design. So now that I've determined what colors I'm going to watercolor with today, I'm going to set up to watercolor. So today in class, I will assign jobs to you, but you will need your plans you should put away somewhere safe so you don't get them full of watercolor paint, so I'm going to set that aside. But today in class, in order to paint, you're going to need a square piece of paper, a 6 by 6 inch piece of paper, which I've already cut for you. You'll need a placemat. There are many different colors. It doesn't matter which color you get in class. You're going to need a paintbrush, and you're going to use this type of brush today. This is a watercolor brush. You can see how the bristles are very fluffy, and that means they would hold a large amount of water while you're painting today. This type of brush is an acrylic paintbrush. This is generally used for acrylic paint, which is a thicker, more permanent kind of paint. So if today, for some reason, you get a brush like this, that wouldn't be the right type of brush to paint with. You'd want to use this type of brush to paint with today. You'll also need watercolors to share with the person sitting next to you today, and you can just arrange them like that and set them next to you and the person who will be sharing them. You'll also need a cup of water, which will be handed out to you, and you will also put this between you and your neighbor, and then you'll be pretty much set to go. So what I'm going to do today before I paint this background is I'm going to, of course, put my name section homeroom on the back side. So I'm going to do that first. And this is really important. That way we will not confuse watercolor papers today, because some of you might be painting in a similar manner to other people in class. Now 6A2 is my morning section, and 6B7 is my afternoon section. Okay, so before I really decide on my colors and before I decide on what I want my background to look like exactly, I think I'm going to do a few practice pieces, just so I work out my colors. I know exactly what types of blues and purples I want to put in my design, and I'm going to also show you a few different techniques that you can use for creating texture in your background. So I'll show you a few previews right now. So this right here on the right, this is what happens when you coat your paper with a wash of watercolors and then you put saran wrap or plastic wrap down and you let it dry in place. It creates this kind of interesting texture. Here's another example. This is salt right here. If you sprinkle salt on a wash of watercolors and let the salt dissolve, you get this kind of effect, which is also, pretty interesting. You can appreciate that. This was created by taking the watercolor paint, applying drops of the watercolor paint on an existing wet surface, and kind of turning your paper this way and letting it drip down. It kind of looks like tie-dye. And then this is just a wash of colors, a blend of greens and purples and blues. And that's what I want everybody to do today at the very least. Pick a few colors that are similar or analogous on the wheel. And remember, ones that are right next to each other. And I want you to take those and wash them on your background. And you can just do something that simple. But if you'd like to do salt or plastic wrap, or if you'd want to drip the paint, the watercolor paint for your background, you could also do that. So I'm just going to show you a few things before I commit to doing my particular background. So, and everybody's welcome in class to do this as well. So here's a little test piece. I don't necessarily have to put my name on it, but let's say today I just want to experiment with the salt first. So I'm going to wet my brush first. The water's over here. I'm just going to wash my paper with water. And I don't have to paint it a bunch of times, just enough to make it wet. Okay, and now since I said I wanted to do blues and purples, I'm going to look here in my watercolors and I'm going to see which shades I want to use. So I guess, you know, maybe this blue looks nice. So I'm going to use this blue. Maybe I'll scooch my water a little closer for this demonstration. And I'm going to wash. And you're going to notice how it's not super bright because the water is going to dilute the paint. And the biggest issue I see with my students is that they'll dig into this many times and try to get the paint to be darker on their paper, and that's not the right thing to do. You want to allow the white from the paper to kind of shine through because it's watercolor. You don't want to leave big white spots behind. I can paint off the paper a little bit and get the paint on my placemat. That's totally fine. So this is just a wash and a blend of two colors, which you could do for your background and leave it that way. But let's say I want to try the salt technique. Number one, don't eat the salt. It's not good for eating. One, you know, it's not great to have a lot of salt in your diet, but also some of this salt, if it would spill out in class, it becomes slippery on the floor. And also, sometimes when it dumps out, I just shimmy it back into the container. Oh, so this salt could be contaminated with things from the floor. So you don't want to eat this today. That'll be, you know, not the best thing to do. So I'm going to take this. When this is still really wet, I'm just going to do a quick sprinkle like this, tiny amount, just a little bit. That amount's good. And then I'm just going to let it dissolve. And then you'll see the effect maybe in a little while, a little bit into class. Sometimes it takes overnight to dry and to get the interesting effect for salt. Once I do that, I wouldn't want to paint over it anymore. I just let it set and dry. And tomorrow in class, we would push the salt off the paper and then see the effect. So this I'm just going to set aside, right? I'm going to try another test piece. Here's another sheet of paper to practice on. I'm going to try the plastic wrap this time. So here I go. I'm going to maybe use some purples today. On this sheet of paper, some purple. Okay, some purple. And maybe some blue again with the purple. Maybe a bit of that magenta too. That's a nice color to use. So maybe I'm going to use this blue. It's almost like a blue-green. This would be okay for my composition as well. This would work for my composition. So I have it almost all coated. And this plastic wrap technique actually works better on darker paper, okay? So darker paper, or not darker paper, I'm sorry, darker watercolors. Okay, so use darker colors to get a better effect with the plastic wrap. So here's my plastic wrap. Sometimes it's really crinkled around itself. So I'm going to take it, kind of spread it out. And then I'm going to take it and kind of crinkle it again, and then set it down and kind of press down the crinkles. And then I'm just going to let it set. Again, I'm not going to lift it off right away. I need to kind of let it dry like that, probably overnight. And then tomorrow I'll peel it off and reveal the texture underneath. So that's a really cool effect. Now these textures for the backgrounds, I could do the entire background in this texture, maybe just a part of it, maybe half of it, or just a corner of it. Okay, so I have that. Let me do one other experiment today. Let's do one where I maybe splatter the paint or kind of drip the watercolor paint. So I think I'll use this magenta. I might not use it for my final background, but I probably could incorporate this magenta with the other colors I have for my shapes and lines. I think it would look pretty nice. So I have this magenta kind of purpley color, and maybe I'll blend in some blue with it as well. That's a dark blue. It's kind of going a little purple on me. And let's say I want to splatter the paint. And I could totally splatter, but the thing is, if I'm going to splatter the paint, I'm just going to do a little flick of my wrist. I'm not going to wind up and really throw the paint, because then I'll get paint on others in the classroom and also make a mess. So let's say I just want to either drip it or splatter it. So maybe I'll splatter with a black. It's neutral, so that would also go with all of your designs. So I could just do this and drip it and let it bleed. It's going to bleed quite a bit when it's on a wet surface. I could also kind of splatter. If I'm going to splatter, I want to make sure the brush is pretty wet. And now I was going to do this, okay? Just a little flick of the wrist. And again, since it's on a very wet background, it's going to bleed a lot. If you were to do this on a slightly drier backgrounds, it wouldn't bleed quite as much. So that's on a wet background. But let's say you would splatter a little bit later in class when your background's a little bit more dry. Okay, so here's the dry backgrounds. And then if I splattered on that, you can see how the splatters stay more concentrated. Okay, they don't bleed because they're not on a wet surface. So that's splattering on more of a dry background. Now, if you wanted to as well, if you wanted to paint your background today and maybe splatter the next day, we could look into you doing that as well. Okay, so now that I've practiced different techniques, now I feel ready, I think, to start my final backgrounds, okay? And you can actually see really quickly, you can see what the salt is doing. Do you guys see that? So the salt's starting to bleed or to dissolve, and it's creating that really cool effect. So that's really nice. So here I go back to my final paper with my name section homeroom on it. And now, since this is going to be for my project, I'm going to, I think I like the salt. It's a nice subtle texture, so I think I'll add salt maybe just to like a corner of my work here possibly. I can also consult one more time and see that I actually don't have a ton of background showing, so I could do the salt. Maybe up in this area I could have the salt showing, but down here I feel like most of the background is covered with shapes. So I think I'll still do the salt though. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to wet my brush again, maybe rinse it out because it has some residual color in it. And I think I want to use this kind of blue-green. This is pretty. I'm going to use this color, okay? And I could wet the paper first or not, actually. I think I'm going to not wet the paper first and just start painting. Now, if I don't wet the paper first, the color tends to be more concentrated and darker. So maybe I want that for my final project. You might notice the paper curling up as you paint today, okay? And that's okay. I have my hands here to support a little bit. This is also not a terribly large paper that you're working on, so maybe it won't curl as much as a larger sheet would. So I'm just brushing over a few times. I'm painting off the edge so I don't have any white spots left behind. You don't have to paint the same section many, many times. Your paper should not break down because it is meant for watercolor, but still, we don't want to paint it again and again and again because it wastes time. And eventually your paper might break down. So we're going to be careful not to do that. So I'm overlapping my colors, okay? So I'm not getting like a stripe effect or anything. It's a little stripey, but I'm not painting like, you know, red, orange, yellow, red, orange, yellow, red, orange, yellow, and stripes. A lot of my students have a tendency to want to do that. So I'd rather in the background that you blend your colors and that they're a little bit more subtle, that you have gradual transitions between your colors, okay? So I'm overlapping a little bit, I'm getting that really pretty purple, and if I want this to retain more of a magenta, actually I'm gonna rinse, gonna get more magenta, and I'm gonna put it down here and blend it in with my purple a bit. So there's a gradual shift again, okay? I don't want harsh lines in here from where the one color starts and another one begins, okay? So maybe I like that for my background. My blends of colors, I have analogous colors. They're similar, they're blending nicely. I don't have too many. I think it'll look nice with possibly these colors. And I can always change these colors around a little bit if I want to tomorrow. I'm not fully set on these. And then I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of salt. It's still really wet, and you want a very wet piece of paper when you use the salt technique. If you notice your paper is starting to dry, you can just re-wet it. Can just put down a little bit more water and make sure it has a good amount on there. And then all I'm gonna do is do a little sprinkle, okay? Just a little sprinkle. I think just there. I don't wanna do too much. And then maybe I'm done. Maybe I think this is all I wanna do. You don't wanna go crazy with your backgrounds either. It can be distracting for your design. So if I'm satisfied with this, at the ends of class when it's time to clean up, I will assign jobs. Certain people will put these back next to the side of the sink. Other people will carry the water cups and the brushes to the side of the sink. Other students will gather the salt containers, and if there's any extra plastic wrap, and put it back on a container by the side of the sink. And other students will have the job of putting all of the projects on one placemat, so you can fit 4 or even 5 for the larger tables, 4 to 5 of these in the drying rack. So when you put these in the drying rack, you arrange all of the works on one sheet, you carry this with 2 hands, and I will show you in class where the drying racks are and how to put your work in the drying rack so that it can dry properly and it'll be ready to go in class for tomorrow. Okay, so that's it. That's the entire demonstration. So I will see if you have any questions in class, and otherwise you guys will be ready to get started today.